the federal government to track prescription drugs from manufacturers to pharmacies. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
I ask unanimous consent further proceedings on the quorum call be suspended, that I be allowed to address the Senate as if in morning business, and I joined in a colloquy with the Senator from South Carolina, Senator Graham.
Without objection. Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, the administration's negotiations with Iran failed to achieve an interim agreement this past weekend. And if published reports are accurate, we owe our French allies a great deal of credit for preventing the major powers in the negotiations, the so-called P5+1, from making a bad interim deal with Iran, a deal that could have allowed Iran to continue making progress on key aspects of its nuclear program, and in return, they would receive an easing of billions of dollars in sanctions. The Senator from South Carolina and I are not opposed to seeking an interim agreement with Iran as a way to create better conditions for negotiations on a final agreement. We joined with some of our colleagues on a letter to the President in support of such an approach before the Geneva Agreement. But our support was conditioned on the need for any interim agreement to be based on the principle of suspension for suspension. That is to say, the Iranians would have to fully suspend their enrichment of uranium and their development of their nuclear weaponization programs and infrastructure, including construction of the heavy water reactor at Arak. The idea would be to freeze Iran's nuclear program in place so that negotiations could proceed on how to roll it back without the threat that the Iranians could use negotiations as a delaying tactic. And I remind my colleagues, they have done that time after time. In fact, the new president of Iran, Mr. Rouhani, bragged when he was negotiator that they were able to fool the negotiators and increase the centrifuges from 150 to 1,000. We've seen the movie before. If Iran agreed, though, to this freeze, we would support, Senator Graham and I said we would support suspension of our efforts to pass and implement new sanctions. Unfortunately, public reports suggest that the administration was willing to agree in Geneva to less than a full suspension of Iran's program and to pay for that inadequate step with billions of dollars in sanctions relief. This is not a, quote, suspension for suspension, regardless of administration claims to the contrary, and that is a problem. It puts too much trust in President Rouhani, the one who I talked about before, who bragged. He bragged about deceiving the international community when he was Iran's nuclear negotiator. In fact, the current diplomatic efforts are consistent with a pattern of past deals undertaken by the Iranian government to buy breathing space and shift international expectations in order to continue development of its nuclear program. We have to avoid an interim agreement that diminishes Iran's incentive to make the hard decisions that we ultimately need them to make as part of a final agreement, and that final agreement must require Iran to do the following: comply with all outstanding UN Security Council resolutions, sign, ratify, and implement the additional protocol of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, address outstanding concerns of the IAEA, especially through expanding inspection measures, halt construction on and ultimately dismantle the Arak heavy water reactor, stop development of advanced centrifuges, and turn its supply of enriched material over to the IAEA. A final agreement should also not recognize that Iran has any inherent right to enrich. A country that has continuously been on the path for nuclear weapons, who has violated protocol after protocol, should not have the, quote, right to enrich. And without these measures, Iran's nuclear program will continue to grow, and as the program grows, it will be harder to track and harder to set back. And only when Iran seriously undertakes measures to dismantle its nuclear program should sanctions be unwound. The administration should not weaken the strong negotiating position that Congress has helped to create. Instead, it should use this position to its advantage. And before I ask my friend from South Carolina to comment, let's not forget the context of Iran and negotiations with Iran. This is an arms control issue, the nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, we seem to ignore the fact that Iran is spreading terror throughout the Middle East and would like to throughout the world. It is the Iranians that have armed and trained and equipped 5,000 Hezbollah that are slaughtering people in Syria. It is Iran that sends the Iranian Revolutionary Guard into Syria and slaughters people. It is Iran that is supporting the Islamic extremist groups that are now moving seriously on the side of Bashar Assad into Syria. It is Iran that is spreading terror throughout the Middle East and would attempt to throughout the world. They still view the United States of America as the great Satan. They are still committed to, quote, wiping Israel off the map. Iran is a threat to peace in the world, and it's not only the issue of nuclear weaponry. It is their entire behavior of spreading terrorism throughout the region, propping up Bashar Assad while he continues to slaughter, maim, rape, torture, and kill. And for this administration and this Secretary of State to ignore those facts about Iran, in my view, is a disgraceful conduct. And I would finally add, before I turn to my friend from South Carolina, the United States' influence and power throughout the world, especially in the Middle East, is no longer there. Every Middle East leader that I talk to, everyone I know in the region, say that they believe the United States is leaving, the United States is not in any way involved, and they are making accommodation for the absence of United States leadership. This president does not believe in American exceptionalism. America must lead, or Iran, Russia, and other countries will lead, and sooner or later, the United States will pay a very, very heavy price. We must not ignore the lessons of history. We've several times in our history tried to withdraw to Fortress America, and every time we've paid a very heavy price. So I would ask my friend from South Carolina, it's important, this Iranian issue. It is of transcendent importance, but I do not believe that it can be viewed in a vacuum, considering Iran's continued effort to try to undermine and destroy everything that America, freedom and democracy, that we stand for.
Well, if I could respond, I guess the essence of what we're trying to say is that we believe Iran is the problem, not the solution to the Mideast and the world at large. And there's been bipartisan support for curtailing and controlling and eventually eliminating the Iranian nuclear program. There's been bipartisan support for our friends in Israel, and we want to keep it that way. We want to make sure that the Congress speaks with one voice, that we are helpful when we can be, and that we offer criticism at an appropriate time. I guess the concerns that we have about this agreement is getting to be more like North Korea in a fashion that makes us all uncomfortable. If you interject billions of dollars into the Iranian economy now without dismantling the centrifuges, I think you've made a huge mistake. What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to make sure the Iranians cannot have the capability to develop a nuclear weapon. The first question you got to ask, are they trying to build a nuclear power plant, a nuclear infrastructure for commercial purposes, or are they trying to create capability to produce a weapon? Trust me on this. Nobody goes about building a commercial nuclear program this way. They're trying to build a nuclear weapon. Why? Because that would give them influence in the region they've never had. It would give Iran a strong standing in the historical Sunni-Shia conflict between the Persians and the Arabs. And as a consequence, it would lead to a nuclear arms race in the Mideast because the Sunni Arabs are not going to allow the Shia Persians to have a nuclear capability. They also believe, I think, fairly rationally so, that if they get a nuclear weapon, the regime is probably home free, that the West is going to back off, much like we did in North Korea. So the decision of how to handle this program is probably the most important decision President Obama will make in his second term, and will be one of the most important decisions the world makes for the future of our planet here going into the 21st century. Yes.
We're friend you for a question. The senator from South Carolina and I have known the Prime Minister of Israel rather well over the years. And obviously, the first target of Iran in the case of a nuclear weapon would be Israel, that Iran has never stepped back from saying that Israel should be wiped from the face of the earth. Has the senator from South Carolina ever known a time since the creation of the State of Israel that the United States and Israel have been further apart, that there has been more open disagreement and indeed tension at a level the likes of which we have never seen? And does it appear as if, by not including Israel in any of the negotiations start with, but also there seems to be a complete disregard of the knowledge, information, and frontline status of Israel in this whole issue?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the tensions are growing, not just with Israel, but one thing the Obama administration's, I think, eagerness to reach a deal is unnerving to the people in the region, not just Israel. The Israelis and the Sunni Arabs have been pushed together in an unprecedented fashion. You're hearing out of the Arab community the same concerns out of the Israeli community. So that's an odd alignment, but I think...
Haven't the Saudis already basically let it be known that if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, that they will be right behind?
Oh, absolutely. It'll create arms race. But one thing, there's a positive note here, the Congress itself. The Congress has not been confused. We're more together on this issue than we've ever been. The Congress passed 90-1 a resolution rejecting the idea of allowing the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon and trying to contain them. The idea of containing a nuclear-armed Iran is not a good idea. We fear they would share the technology with a terrorist group. It would wind its way here in the United States. Israel believes they could never have a moment of peace with a nuclear-armed Iran. Containment won't work. Secondly, the Congress 99-0 said if Israel has to defend herself against a nuclear-capable Iran, has to intervene to stop this existential threat to the Jewish state, that we would provide political, economic, and military support in a resolution 99-0. So the Congress has been very much together. The next thing we hope to do is have a resolution, bipartisan in nature, that defines the end game. What are we trying to accomplish? We don't want a war. Nobody wants a war. The idea of the Iranians having a commercial nuclear power plant is okay with me. Mexico and Canada have commercial nuclear power facilities. They just don't enrich uranium. They buy the product from the world community. They don't have enrichment or reprocessing. I don't mind the Iranians having nuclear power plants for commercial purposes as long as the international community controls the fuel cycle. Here's the problem. They're insisting on the right to enrich, and the problem is you can take uranium and enrich it to a certain level for commercial purposes, and with today's technology, you can break out and have a nuclear weapon very quickly. So why in the world?
And could I ask, aren't the parameters of this proposed agreement that to allow them to continue to enrich materials?
The concern the Israelis have and you and I have is the number of centrifuges available to the Iranians is into the tens of thousands now, pushing from 18 to 24,000. Who really knows? But the advanced centrifuges that we're talking about can take 3.5% enriched uranium and go to 90% to get a weapon in just a matter of weeks, if not months. So here's the rub. I think the Congress will speak with one voice. We don't mind the commercial capability for the Iranians as long as you control the fuel cycle. As to the previously enriched uranium, particularly the 20% stockpile, turn it over to the international community. That's the UN position. Stop enriching. There's no right to enrich. And at the end of the day, this plutonium heavy water reactor that you're building is a threat to Israel beyond belief. Dismantle that reactor. You don't need a heavy water plutonium producing reactor to engage in commercial power production. So these are the things that we would like to let the administration know that would be a successful outcome regarding the Congress, and they actually mirror the UN resolutions. So I'm hopeful that we can find a way to end the nuclear program in Iran in a win-win situation for the Iranians and the world at large. But here's the one thing we can't afford to do is get it wrong with Iran. And these negotiations, the interim agreement, as Senator McCain so well stated, sent chills up the spine of almost everybody in the region. So if the Iranians insist upon enriching, to have the ability to take uranium and enrich it in the future, I think that is a non-starter. That would be incredibly dangerous. And you'll wake up one day with a North Korea in the Mideast. And the one thing I can tell you, if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, it will be far more destabilizing than North Korea having a nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula. It will open up Pandora's box. So I am hopeful that the administration will go into the next round of negotiations eyes wide open, understanding where the American people, the international community is at, the people in the region. And if we get a deal, it is a good deal. And what's a good deal? To make sure the Iranians can have a peaceful nuclear power program but can't get a bomb. And the only way they can get a bomb is to have enrichment capability as part of an agreement. If they insist on enriching, that tells you all you need to know about their intention. Mexico and Canada and 15 other nations have nuclear power plants for commercial purposes, but they don't insist on enriching uranium to provide the fuel. If they insist on enriching, that tells you all you need to know about what their true intent is. So, Senator McCain, thank you for bringing your voice and, you know.
And it's also true that the right to enrich is undercut by their many years' record of deception and efforts at acquiring a nuclear weapon. And finally, again, I want to emphasize, our Israeli friends are on the front line. It's not the United States of America that the Ayatollahs have committed to, quote, wipe off the face of the earth, that have been dedicated ever since the Iranian Revolution to the extinction of the State of Israel. So shouldn't we pay close attention? We aren't dictated by Israeli behavior, but shouldn't we profit by their experiences? Twice the Israelis have had to go act militarily against nuclear facilities. Twice they've had to do that in order to prevent, in one case Syria and another case Iraq, from acquiring nuclear weapons which would threaten them with extinction. Now this agreement, clearly in the words of the Israeli Prime Minister, is something that is very dangerous to the very existence of the State of Israel. Again, Israel does not dictate American policy, but to ignore the warnings of literally every expert in the Middle East, especially that of Israel, including Arab countries, I think is ignoring evidence and opinions that are very, very well informed. And to get an agreement for the sake of an agreement, in my view, would be a disaster.
And just to conclude, why are the Iranians at the table? Because the sanctions are working. The Congress have passed tough sanctions to the Obama administration's credit. They've put together an international coalition unprecedented in nature that has gotten the Iranians' attention, and we're at the table. the last thing we want to do is relieve the pressure, because that's what got them there. There's two things that they must understand. Until you abandon your nuclear quest for a bomb and replace it with a reasonable solution for commercial nuclear power aspirations, we will continue sanctions, and the threat of military force is also one of the things that got them to the table. And Jay Carney said something yesterday: if you push for new sanctions, you're inviting war. I would just like to respond. I think the reason we're having a peaceful opportunity moment here is because of the sanctions. If you back off now and infuse billions of dollars into the Iranian economy and you leave the centrifuges in place, you're inviting an attack by Israel. If you don't shut down the plutonium heavy water reactor, Israel's not going to sit on the sidelines forever. So to not have a continuation of sanctions until we get the right answer is going to invite more destabilizing the region. And you got to realize that Israel's in a different position than almost anybody else. They're close. The Iranians have talked about wiping them off the map. And when it comes to the Jewish people, they don't take that stuff lightly anymore. When they say never again, they literally mean it. And can you tell the Prime Minister of Israel, given the behavior of the Iranians in the last 30 years, that they're just joking? Can you tell the people of the United States if the Iranians got a nuclear weapon, they wouldn't share it with a terrorist group to come our way? Name one thing they've produced they haven't shared. So this is a moment of history. This is the biggest decision President Obama will make, and I'd like to help him make the right decision. I'd like to help the world to resolve this problem without a war, but here's the situation we find ourselves in. If you attacked Iran to stop their nuclear program, if you couldn't get a peaceful ending, you would open up Pandora's box. It would be difficult. But if they got a nuclear weapon, you would empty Pandora's box. That's the world in which we live in. We've got a little time left here to get this right. I hope we can.
I appreciate the patience of my friend from Iowa, and I thank the senator from South Carolina. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I would like to cover for a little bit here about the bill that we're actually on, the Drug Quality and Security Act. Before I do that, I ask consent that at the end of my remarks that the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Ayotte, be recognized to speak.
Without objection.
1 year ago, we were at the beginning of our effort to understand one of the worst public health crises this country has experienced in recent years. We were just learning about the New England Compounding Center's astonishing disregard for basic procedures to ensure that the products that they were manufacturing were sterile. We were shocked and saddened by the news that hundreds were sick, dozens had died from infections caused by NECC's blatant disregard for patient safety. And we were fearful for the fate of the thousands of additional patients who had received injections of NECC's products. Despite the urgency of that crisis, the bill we are considering today was not slapped together overnight. Far from it. It's the product of a full year of careful, bipartisan policy collaboration, and it rests upon the factual foundation developed through the bipartisan oversight investigation that Senator Alexander and I launched over a year ago. When we learned of the NECC tragedy, we did not rush to pick up a pen and dash off a quick legislative answer. Instead, we sought to understand what that story was, what its causes were, so that we could develop legislation that would make a difference in the future and not just make headlines. So in early October of 2012, shortly after the outbreak became known, and this was what the outbreak looked like, we had all these states, 64 deaths, 750 people got sick. And when I say got sick, I don't mean they just got sick overnight and they got better. Some of these people who lived will have lingering illnesses for the remainder of their lives, debilitating illnesses, in many, many cases where they will never be able to work again because of meningitis. My partner's home state of Tennessee was very hard hit with 153 cases. Michigan was the highest with 264 cases. But this is what it looked like when this outbreak occurred, and as you can see, mostly in the East Coast, a couple out west, starting to spread that direction. Thankfully, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention was able to intervene and find the source of this and stop it. Again, another example of how CDC protects the American people. So again, when this happened, we began to talk directly with various stakeholders to understand it. We continued to talk to the FDA and the CDC on their investigations. We held briefing calls with the Massachusetts Board of Pharmacy. That's where the NECC was located. We talked to an array of compounding pharmacies and purchasers of compounded products. On October 25th of last year, to explore the need for and the potential contours of legislation, the committee launched a bipartisan process to examine the respective state and federal roles in regulating compounding pharmacy. My oversight team worked with Senator Alexander to gather documents from FDA and from the state of Massachusetts that shed light upon how NECC had been allowed to grow so large with so little oversight. Last November, we released an initial report and held a hearing exploring the statutory and regulatory gaps that contribute to this tragedy. Our bipartisan investigation continued and culminated in a final report that was released on May 22nd of this year. Over the course of this investigation, we explored how drug compounding has evolved as an industry over the past couple of decades. Now, drug compounding is a traditional and long-standing activity of pharmacies. It serves an important role in our healthcare system. Compounding is when just a few people, maybe only one person, needs a certain compound of a drug. So a pharmacist, maybe not with the classic mortar and pestle, but with other devices, mixes, compounds the specific drug that's needed. Maybe it's needed for a few people in a hospital, a specific illness, a chronic illness that someone might have. This is traditional compounding, where you can't just get a prescription for it and go down to the pharmacy and have it filled simply because there's not that big of a demand for it. That's sort of the traditional role of compounding. But over the last couple of decades, a number of large-scale drug compounding companies have started to produce large batches of high-risk drugs for national sale. For example, at the time of the meningitis outbreak, NECC's sister company called Ameridose was providing prepared IV mixtures, intravenous mixtures, to 25,000 hospitals and facilities across the country. Despite a scope of operations that make these companies much more similar to drug manufacturers than to pharmacies, they primarily faced oversight similar to state-licensed community pharmacies, rather than the more rigorous quality standards governing traditional drug manufacturers. So NECC and Ameridose both had lengthy track records, our investigation found, of producing drugs of questionable sterility and potency, and both had been the subject of repeated adverse event reports and consumer complaints. The committee review of FDA documents indicates that between 2002 and 2012, NECC was the subject of at least 52 adverse event reports, exposing the dangers created by its hazardous compounding practices, with documented issues including the failure to ensure the sterility of equipment and products, the distribution of drugs containing particulate matter, the manufacture of suprapotent and subpotent drugs, mislabeling of drugs, inaccurate beyond-use dating, and the illegal distribution of drugs in the absence of patient-specific prescriptions. Similarly, between 2007 and 2012, internal documents indicate that Ameridose was the subject of at least 18 adverse event reports. Ameridose was cited in 2008 for producing a compounded version of the pain reliever fentanyl that was more than 100% stronger than the standard level. What was happening at NECC during this time period was unfortunately an example of a larger problem across the country. In an effort to understand better the risk posed by increasingly large drug compounding companies, the FDA undertook surveys of compounded drugs in 2001 and 2006. In each of those surveys, about one-third of the drugs sampled failed one or more standard quality tests. In 2006 survey of sterile injectable drugs, 33% of the samples contained either not enough or too much of the active drug ingredient. Between 2001 and 2011, FDA documents indicate that at least 25 deaths and 36 serious injuries, including hospitalizations, were linked to large-scale drug compounding companies, including 13 deaths in 2011 alone. Between 1998 and 2005, FDA documented at least 38 deaths and 210 injuries from drugs that were contaminated, mislabeled, or caused overdoses because they contained more of the active pharmaceutical ingredient than indicated. These included the deaths of 6 infants and children, and at least 18 other children paralyzed, burned, hospitalized, or suffering from other severe reactions. And these numbers likely understate the actual number of adverse events because current law, unlike what we have in this bill, does not require reporting of adverse events. So our bipartisan investigation concluded that large-scale drug compounders continue to pose a serious risk to public health. At the time of our final report in May, we had identified at least 48 compounding companies that had been found to be producing and selling drugs that were contaminated or created in unsafe conditions in just the preceding 8 months since this outbreak. 48 compounding companies we found selling drugs that were contaminated or created in unsafe conditions. So I guess what I'm saying is if you follow this, this had been going on for some time, but it kept getting worse and worse and worse as more and more of these large-scale drug compounders found they could, quote, get away with it. They could just get away with it. In that same time, 10 drug compounders had issued national recalls because of concerns about contamination. 11 drug compounders had been ordered by state licensing agencies to stop producing some or all drugs. So our investigation concluded that in order to reduce the serious and ongoing risk to the public health from compounded drug products, it is essential that a clear statutory framework be enacted that requires entities compounding drugs outside of traditional pharmacy practice to engage in good manufacturing practices and to better ensure the sterility and quality of their drugs. So we developed this bill, the DQSA as we call it, to address the regulatory gaps that we identified in this investigation. Under the legislation before us, large compounders like NECC or any other compounder that chooses to operate outside of traditional pharmacy practice have only one legal option. They must register with the FDA. They must follow good manufacturing practices. They must tell FDA when their products hurt people. And otherwise, they must follow the manufacturer-like requirements that apply to outsourcing facilities under this bill. If they are not traditional compounders and they do not meet the requirements for outsourcing facilities, our bill says FDA can shut them down immediately. So the Drug Quality and Security Act is a carefully crafted bill that not only responds to the NECC outbreak, but to the root causes that I've gone over that goes back almost 2 decades that really kind of led up to this tragedy. So it's good bipartisan policy. I pointed out the other day in my remarks, I'll point out again here that it has wide industry and consumer support, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Pharmacists Association, Chamber of Commerce of the United States, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, large drug manufacturers, and also, again, consumer groups, the Center for Science and Democracy, Center for Medical Consumers, and others. So both consumer and industry support. So, Mr. President, I wanted to take this time to lay out the background and why this bill is so vitally important. And I will also point out that the House of Representatives passed this bill on a voice vote. Voice vote. And now we have it here at the desk. And it's the same basic bill that we passed out of our committee on a bipartisan, unanimous vote out of our committee. And so here we are. We had last night a 97-to-1 vote on cloture to proceed to this bill. 97-to-1. That had to be an indication that this is an important bill, but one that has broad bipartisan support. So now, under the rules of the Senate, we have 30 hours, of which I'm now taking my part of 1 hour. I don't intend to take the whole hour. So then we go 30 hours, then we get on the bill. And if this one person continues to object, well, I guess we'll have to file cloture on the bill. That will take 2 days to ripen. 2 days for cloture to ripen. Then we'll have yet another vote on cloture on the bill. I assume we'll get 97-to-1. Then we have another 30 hours after that, and then we vote. I think that takes us to Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, if we stay here. Again, this is not really part of what I want to talk about, but I think, again, it's important to note that this is another reason why and I can only speak for myself, why I have supported a change in the rules of the Senate since 1995. We cannot continue to be a 21st century country, to be a major world power, and operate under 19th century rules and regulations. It's just not right that one person, one senator, any senator, I'm not pointing fingers at any one, I'm saying anybody, any one senator, in the face of a bill that is not only vital for the health and safety of the American people, but which has broad bipartisan support, that one person could tie up the Senate for literally a week or more through procedural roadblocks. And that's why I say we need to do something about the rules around this place. Again, if this is a contentious issue, well, I can see the need to slow things down. But this has to do with health and safety of the American people. A lot of time and effort went into this bill by Republicans and Democrats, FDA, CDC, pharmaceutical companies, consumer groups. And that's why it has, I think, such broad support. So I would hope that we don't have to go through all this. But if we do, we do. I mean, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that this bill will pass, and it will probably pass on a 97-to-1 vote. But why tie up the Senate for all this time? Why put off the signing of a bill that will get things in motion to protect the health and safety of the American people? So I hope that we can bring this to a resolution, have a vote up or down on it. Quite frankly, I think we'd probably voice vote the bill. I think we'd ask unanimous consent, but for one person, then we can voice vote it. Well, maybe there's an objection. Maybe we do have to have a roll call. If someone wants a roll call, that's their right. But at least let's vote on the bill and get it out of here, Mr. President. That's the least we can do to protect the health and the safety of the American people. For that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week I came to the floor to discuss the negative impact that Obamacare is having on the people of New Hampshire. And I shared dozens of compelling stories from my constituents who are telling me that they're seeing their coverage canceled and they are seeing their premiums rise. Mr. President, these sad stories continue to arrive in my inbox every day. And these are real people, and they're having great difficulty with not only the website, but structural problems that exist with the law itself. They deserve to have their voices heard here on the floor of the United States Senate, And I will say that, as one of my constituents said to me, lives in New Hampshire are depending on it. Last week, President Obama said he was sorry to those who are now receiving cancellation notices, but a simple apology falls short, because the structural problems we are now seeing with this law, including the cancellation notices that too many of my constituents are receiving, were problems that many in this chamber, even before I got elected to the United States Senate, warned about before the law was passed. Here are some of the stories I want to share from people in New Hampshire and how they're being impacted by this law. Jeannie in Meredith wrote me that she was diagnosed with breast cancer 2.5 years ago. She was laid off from her job of 20 years and then went on COBRA. Jeannie traveled to Mass General in Boston to receive care, and when her coverage ran out, she worked with her insurance agent to receive coverage that she could afford and that would allow her to continue with her subsequent treatments without any interruptions. She's now told me that what she has worked out and the plan she had has been canceled. She wrote me, "I like my plan, and I not only liked my doctors, I consider them my lifeline. If I purchase a plan under the exchange, I lose access to all my doctors in Boston, and I'm finding that I will also lose my oncologist in Nashua as well. This can't be happening." Lori in Littleton wrote to me. She told me that she and her husband recently were notified that their coverage will be canceled. When she learned about the new plan that was being offered to comply with Obamacare, she said, "We were shocked that the cost would be $400 a month more than we are currently paying. This is way beyond our budget." So we began to explore the so-called exchange to shop for all of our choices. Once again, we were very frustrated to learn that New Hampshire has a monopoly with only one carrier on the exchange. What I've also heard from my constituents is concerns that they are receiving notices that their premiums are rising as a result of Obamacare. Sarah in Newcastle wrote me that her premium for a high-deductible plan that complies with Obamacare will be double her current premium. Moreover, Sarah said that she will no longer be able to go to Portsmouth Hospital, my primary care physician, gynecologist, eye doctor, and children's pediatrician are all excluded from the ACA plan that I will be forced to purchase by the end of 2014. She finished the letter she wrote to me by saying, "No, my family is not better off with the ACA." John in Pembroke wrote, "The new law is called the Affordable Care Act. What a hurtful joke that is to hardworking Americans. My existing policy is being canceled. After I called Anthem to inform them they must have misheard the President and other supporters of the ACA, they told me that my existing policy did not meet the standards for the new law." I was shocked. The new higher plans from Anthem in the best-case scenario are more than double my existing plan. David in Nashua wrote me. Recently, he saw his coverage canceled, like too many others. He wrote, "When working with Anthem to get a plan that will have the closest coverages and plan services with similar deductibles and copays, I was disheartened to learn that it will cost me an additional $110 per month, about 40% more than I was paying." He continued, "To get comparable services to what I had, it will cost an additional $45 per month. All I said is I am looking at an increase of $150 per month." David said he's looking at a 57% increase in costs and an additional $1,800 per year. He said to me, "This is grossly unacceptable, has been misleading from the words conveyed by the President, and downright frustrating to have to deal with such a problem." A couple from Amherst, New Hampshire wrote me and said, "Because of the Affordable Care Act, our health insurance plan is being canceled, and the least expensive plan, either within the exchange or outside of it, will more than double our costs. The least expensive plan we can obtain will increase our monthly premium from $582 to $1,183 per month. Our annual premium under the new health care law will increase from $6,984 to $14,196, an increase of over $7,000. To me, President Obama promised us that if we liked our plan, we could keep it, but ours has been canceled. President Obama promised us that if we liked our doctor, we could keep our doctor. President Obama promised us that under the new health care law, we would save $2,500, but our premiums will be increasing by over $7,000 a year. A couple from Center Sandwich also contacted me saying that their rates will double and cost them an additional $7,000 per year. They wrote, "We are both in our second careers and in our 50s, working hard and doing two jobs. Blue-collar couple who are very healthy. Under the so-called Affordable Care Law, our rates are going to double." Scott from Concord wrote to me, "I currently have a great family plan through my work. This plan costs me $240 per month. On January 1st, this plan will cost me $600 per month. I can't afford to pay such a high premium. Now I am forced to get a plan that has a 50% greater deductible and much higher copays." I also heard from a mother from Manchester. She has a little girl who is scheduled to have surgery at the beginning of January. As any mother would be, she's worried, and now she's been told that her plan has been canceled. She wrote, "I looked and my current plan is not available through the exchange. I will have to purchase a plan with a higher deductible. The new plan will cost over $1,200 per month, increasing my premium, which is currently just over $1,000 per month. The new plans through the exchange have a smaller network of doctors, so I could be losing my doctors too." Finally, I'm hearing frustration and concerns from my constituents about the website. David in Bedford wrote me that my wife and I are semi-retired and we've been trying since October 1st to obtain health insurance through healthcare.gov. We've also used the telephone option, but we are unable so far to obtain coverage. He finished this message to me by saying, "We are very concerned with being without coverage on January 1st of 2014. I heard a similar concern from a resident in Greenfield who also expressed deep concern about private information put on the website. I heard the same from a registered nurse from Milford, expressing frustrations about how the exchange is working. And there are many more pieces of correspondence that I've received from my constituents, and I won't share them all on the floor today, but their voices deserve to be heard, because this law, right now, people in New Hampshire are losing coverage that they thought they could keep. They are getting premium increase notices that they cannot afford to pay that are attributed to the Obamacare. And finally, as I've risen to the floor before and spoken, some are having their hours cut because it defines the work week now as a 30-hour work week. And unfortunately, people who do want to continue to work more are being harmed by this. So as I've done before, I come to the floor today to call for a timeout on Obamacare. A timeout because we are seeing that the problems with this law are much deeper than a website. We hope that those will be fixed. Of course, they haven't yet. The Washington Post reported today that they may not even be fixed with what the administration has represented at the end of this month. That said, what about the canceled policies, the premium increases, the lost hours? It is time to have a timeout where we do what should have been done in the beginning. Instead of passing a law of this magnitude on a partisan basis, people need to come together to address health care, rising costs, access, and the issues that the American people want us to take on. But this law is not the answer, and the American people and the people of New Hampshire deserve better. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I know that Senator Murray is next. I just want to ask and ask consent that Teresa Danso-Danqua, Emily Flores, and Charles Hayes of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's session.
Without objection. The Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the issue that got me into politics many years ago in the first place, early childhood education. And I want to thank my friend and colleague, Chairman Harkin, whose leadership on this critical issue is unparalleled, and I'm delighted he is on the floor today as well. I also want to thank Senators Casey and Hirono for their strong support of early childhood education. They are great partners in this work as well. And Mr. President, of the 535 members of Congress, I just have to say, each one of us comes to Washington, D.C. with our own unique backgrounds. We're a collection of military veterans and farmers and business owners and a lot more. Well, as for me, I come to Congress as a mother and a preschool teacher. When my kids were much younger, I found out that their wonderful preschool program was being closed down by my state because of budget cuts. So when they were very young, I put them in my car and traveled to Olympia, our state capital, 100 miles away, to explain to these legislators, who I didn't know, why they just could not cut this important program. Well, when I got there, legislators told me there was nothing someone like me could do to save that preschool program. And one legislator in particular told me I was just a mom in tennis shoes and I had no chance of changing anything. He said I couldn't make a difference. Well, that made me slightly mad. And I drove home and I picked up my phone and I started calling other moms and dads, and they called moms and dads from around our state. And over time, about 3 months, we organized thousands of families in our state, and we wrote letters and we held rallies, and when all was said and done, the legislature listened to us and they reinstated that preschool program. I went on to teach in that program and as a preschool teacher, and then I served on my local school board. So, Mr. President, when I eventually did come here to Washington, D.C. as a U.S. Senator, I knew firsthand that if we want to strengthen our economy and give our kids a brighter future, we could not wait until they were teenagers or adults to invest in them. I had seen that in my own classrooms, that when young children get the attention they need, they are miles ahead of their peers on a path to success. I saw my own students who knew how to raise their hand or ask a question or stand in line to go to recess were the ones that were then able to go on to tackle a full curriculum in school. So that's why this week I joined a bipartisan group of colleagues to introduce legislation that will give every American child access to high-quality early education. The bill, the Strong Start for America's Children Act, aims to significantly increase access to and quality of early learning programs that start when a child is born and last until their first day of kindergarten. This legislation authorizes a federal program that supports our individual states' efforts to educate their youngest citizens. It makes sure that early learning programs everywhere have quality teachers and meet high standards, but it also provides states and school districts and preschool programs the flexibility they need to meet their local children's needs. And although I approach this issue today as a grandmother and a mother and a former preschool teacher, many of my colleagues have their own reasons to support early education. Former law enforcement officers and lawyers and sheriffs whom I work with know that when we invest in our children at a young age, they are more likely to stay out of trouble and out of jail. Business leaders and economists know that when we spend $1 on a child's education in the first few years of their life, we save as much as $17 throughout their life. Our military leaders tell me that 75% of our nation's 17 to 24-year-olds are ineligible to serve their country, often because they can't pass the necessary math and reading tests. So it's not only teachers who are fighting for pre-K, it's generals and sheriffs and CEOs. And Mr. President, 50 years of research backs this up. We know that 80% of a person's brain development occurs before the age of 5. But while China is aiming to provide 70% of their children with 3 years of preschool by 2020, and India is doing the same, we today do not have a national strategy to get the youngest Americans ready to learn. A Nobel Prize-winning economist, James Heckman, an advocate for early learning, says that skill begets skill. You know, this summer I traveled throughout my home state of Washington visiting early learning programs, and I heard from a kindergarten teacher who told me that while some of her students in kindergarten are practicing writing their names on their work, others are learning how to hold a pencil. These children, at an early age, are already playing catch-up. So when a child who's benefited from early education knows how to open up a book and turn a page, someone can teach them to read. But, Mr. President, in classrooms across our country, some children are falling behind. And that gap between children who start school ready to succeed and those who don't has serious implications for our country's future. Though historically we've invested in education to build a path to middle class, we are now falling behind. We now rank 28th globally in the proportion of 4-year-olds enrolled in pre-K and 25th globally in public funding for early learning. That cannot continue. So, Mr. President, in the coming weeks and months, I'll be working with my chairman, Senator Harkin, who's here today, with many others, to work towards making some smart investments in our education system to move this legislation forward. Our country is in very large part the product of decisions that were made decades ago. The decision to make public education a priority now will have an extraordinary impact on the next generation. We are choosing every day between being a country that is struggling to catch up or being a country that has the knowledge and the power to continue to lead. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to again advocate for no Washington exemption from Obamacare, an issue I've talked about with several of our colleagues in this body, joined by many supporters of the push in the House of Representatives. And I think it's very important. You know, as we hear story after story from Americans in each of our states about what they're facing, being dropped from policies they liked, they wanted to keep, having premium increases of 1,000% in some cases, getting their work hours cut back to under 30 hours a week. As we hear all these horror stories, the fact remains that Washington essentially has an exemption from all that pain, has a big taxpayer-funded subsidy that nobody else in America at the same income level can get. And that really needs to end. And one critical component of this issue is the fact that even though the Obamacare statute said clearly that every member of Congress and all of our official staff had to go to the exchanges for their health care, and of course mentioned nothing about any huge taxpayer-funded subsidy. In fact, that language was considered and not included. Even though that's crystal clear under the statute, the Obama administration issued a special rule to get around that clear language. Part of that rule, which I think is outrageous on its face, says, well, we don't know who official staff are. We can't determine that, so we're going to leave it up to each individual member of Congress to determine who their official staff are. And as long as they deem certain staff non-official, then they don't have to go to the exchanges at all. They don't have to follow that clear mandate in the statute itself. Well, again, Mr. President, when you're talking about folks who work on our staff and committee staff and leadership staff, that's ridiculous. They're clearly official staff. They're not campaign staff. They're not off Capitol Hill outside of government. They're not working for other entities. They're clearly official staff. This is just one of the major ways this illegal rule does an end run around the clear language of the statute. In reaction to that part of the illegal rule, I entered a bill that simply says these decisions by each individual member of the Senate and the House need to be made public. There need to be full disclosure when anybody is using this end run around and saying, yes, this person works for me, but somehow they're not official, so they don't have to follow the mandate of Obamacare to go to the exchanges. That information should absolutely be public. And I put that in the form of a bill which I've filed both as a freestanding bill and as an amendment to the measure before the Senate today. Now, whatever we think about the underlying issues, and I know there's disagreement, to me it should be a no-brainer that there's full disclosure about how each individual office handles the situation. That is not fully disclosed now. Some members may choose to say it to the press, to answer press questions, but it is not public information. It seems clear to me that how each office elects to handle that situation, how each elected member elects to handle that situation should be, by definition, public information, fully disclosed. And the measure I'm talking about right now, that's all it does. It doesn't prohibit anything else from going on. I object to that. I have other measures that I'll push to prohibit it. But all the measure I'm talking about right now does is make sure that that information, that election by each individual member is public. There's full disclosure about something I think clearly the public has a right to know about. So I'm simply here on the floor lobbying for that measure to pass and lobbying for a vote opportunity up or down on that important provision. Now, my first choice would be a simple vote on the measure in front of the Senate right now, the drug compounding bill. And I have no interest in delaying progress of that bill. I simply want an amendment vote on the measure I'm describing. We can vote it up or down. Either way, I think it's crystal clear that this bill will proceed to become law. If my amendment is adopted, it would be voted on in the House. I think it would clearly be passed, become law. And that's my first choice request here. If that's not possible, I do have a second choice request, which is to simply make this vote in order in the context of the next major bill coming to the floor, the National Defense Authorization Act. Again, a simple amendment, a simple vote, and I have no interest in delaying the time running on the consideration of this bill, on delaying votes on this bill, or of delaying debate and voting on other amendments on the defense authorization bill. It seems to me that that's a very basic, straightforward request, a vote on a pure disclosure provision. By the way, this provision has been hotlined on the Republican side, and there is no Republican objection to the substance of this provision. It's pure disclosure. We all think it should be public information. There is no objection. And so, Mr. President, I would simply ask unanimous consent to proceed in this way and expedite in the process consideration of all of this, including the compounding bill on the floor right now. The distinguished floor manager for the bill said a few minutes ago he doesn't want delay on this bill. I don't want it either. There doesn't have to be any delay, and in fact, this unanimous consent will expedite all of that consideration. In that spirit, I ask unanimous consent that all remaining time on the motion to proceed to H.R. 3204, the compounding bill, be yielded back, that the motion to proceed be agreed to, that my amendment number 2024 be the only amendment in order, that no second-degree amendments be in order, and that the amendment be subject to a 60-vote affirmative threshold for adoption. I further ask that there be 2 hours of debate equally divided, and that upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate proceed to a vote on my amendment. Following the disposition of my amendment, that the bill as amended, if amended, be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Iowa.
I object.
The objection is heard.
Well, Mr. President, reclaiming my time, that's unfortunate.